as well. But it's not just the labor issues. It has to do with OSHA too, right? Which
Department of Labor also.
is it? Okay. Because I think it was also EPA gets involved to a certain extent. But all of these areas, by and large, based on my research and talking to individuals, the Department of Labor is either poorly staffed and doesn't follow through, but the laws in and of themselves are not really pursued. Enforcement of the laws are not pursued in that area.
In OSHA and EPA, the actual enforcement is done by the states.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true of labor laws also, the rest of the DOL?
I know that there are investigators from the Department of Labor and that the states work with them. I don't know exactly how it plays out with regards to bringing an action, like suing or fining an organization.
There's a lot of really important information here, and I'm processing 3 different avenues of your discussion. The first is a discussion about the basic structures of justice, where we as a community and where we as a nation fail these people to give them the basic goods that they need to survive. The second is the stuff just asked about OSHA and labor, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the third is a pragmatic response to the second. And here's, I guess, the question that I'm asking. Your solution seems to be, and I think it's a very useful and important one, that the government is not doing its job, and therefore we need to make these things transparent so that people will put pressure on the government. I think that's right.
For reform. Mm-hmm.
But isn't relying on relying on the community for moral outrage and consumer outrage, contributing to the demonization of government that eviscerated the OSHA, eviscerates the Department of Labor, isn't the answer, well, yes, we need 100 times the funding for regulation enforcement. We need 100 times the funding for people to go into these communities. We need to treat refugees with equal status to as citizens, natural-born citizens. And so I guess the question I'm asking ultimately boils down to is, are the pragmatic elements of your recommendation undermining the argument that what's really happening here is a failure to adequately fund and respect government roles in these circumstances?
Undermining that argument or supporting it?
Well, undermining it ultimately in the sense that what you're saying, and again, I think you're right, is, look, there are these internal third worlds. There's these people who are abusing our most vulnerable populations, and so what we need to do is make sure that the general public knows this stuff, so they won't buy these products. Mm-hmm. When in fact, a long-term, more effective approach would be, we need all of these people to force Congress and state governments to fully fund and increase their funding for the regulation of these laws that already exist.
Mm-hmm. So there are 2 aspects here. One is that you've identified in this area. By the approach that I recommend, when individuals have access to the information, the transparency, going back to the whole efficient capital markets theory, et cetera, not just in stocks, but if we're talking about like a lamb or something like that, right? If the buyer has all the necessary information out there to make an informed decision, they can decide, I want to buy lamb here, or I want to buy the leg of lamb here. Arguably, if they have that information, they can decide, if it matters to them, to buy from an organization that doesn't inflict damage or violate the law with regards to their employee workforce. So what that does is it takes the government essentially out of the loop as soon as transparency is achieved and seeks to hit the corporation where it counts, because it brings us back to what is the corporation required to do? By law, their duty is to the shareholders, right? And so if everybody's going over to buy the leg of lamb from the corporation that has made disclosure, and the disclosure makes the public happy, this other organization that doesn't make the disclosure, or whatever they disclose doesn't make the public happy, has inflicted damage upon that bottom line because they're losing customers. So that's one avenue of, dare I say, regulation that comes from public scrutiny, right? So it takes that whole argument out of the picture about we need to fund the government more, which may be the undermining argument, right? However, in order to achieve transparency, we need to fund the SEC at least more. On the other hand, however, if the public is able to see that leg of lamb X, leg of lamb Y has no potential violations to human rights or law issues, and X does, and they start to see that this matters to availability of resources to the public, or they care about the human rights issues, et cetera, it's public scrutiny, public opinion that changes the law and changes the funding that goes to the government. So based on us knowing, we can make the informed decision that, yes, we want to fund the government more so that we actually are enforcing OSHA, the labor laws, EPA issues, et cetera, and therefore vote in certain ways.
And again, I think you're right, and I'm sympathetic to both points of view. I think in the long run, we'd be better off with the second approach than the first, and in part because, or let me ask it this way, to what extent do people really have the choice that you are postulating? So
the public, you mean?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so you bring up Foxconn and you bring up Apple. But Foxconn and Conflict Minerals are being, but let's stick with Foxconn. Foxconn also makes stuff for Microsoft and Dell and Cisco and Motorola, and I can think of a dozen things in my office that are not Apple that are under Foxconn. And so if you can't buy a smartphone from Apple or Motorola or Dell or Microsoft, is the choice ultimately no smartphone or no electronics at all? And so I guess the question is, how much choice do we really have with these major corporations, especially with their subsidiaries and other things? And because I'm skeptical of our ability to make those choices, I think in the end that's why I'm more attracted to the changing the government approach rather than the consumer focus.
I know that the issue varies by industry. Okay, so while it may not be effective in the smartphone industry, it may be effective in the leg of lamb industry, for instance. However, I agree with you that to a certain extent it's more an effort in frustration. But the other consumer aspect is who provides investment to the organizations, right? So maybe people can't avoid buying smartphones that have conflict minerals, or they can't avoid buying meat in general, but that's the general consumer. But a consumer who decides to invest in an organization, whether as on the public market or in the private market, has a better chance of affecting that organization's operations. And so it may mean that they have an iPhone, and many times, for instance, with the 1502, the conflict minerals legislation, what they're targeting is the massive investors, right, the institutional investors. And so if there's a decision, whether it's ethical investing in a certain fund, et cetera, to not socket this money here, that company misses out. Money in means the stock price goes up, right? So not only through consumers buying of goods and widgets, but also, or produce, but also through investing is the first part of the bifurcated approach. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I was just going to make a comment that I think history says you're right, that more transparency will lead to more pressure on government to regulate better and to enforce compliance. I mean, you look at the history of how these laws got put on the books in the first place. It was, you know, muckrakers going into meatpacking plants and exposing bad practices.
Steinbeck.
So, you know, the more that practices can be exposed and in the press, the more likely we are to actually fund what we need. Because clearly, labor laws are just, enforcement of that stuff is so underfunded, I'm sure.
My point, not surprisingly, is a philosophical one, right? Which is that in the last 20 to 30 years, maybe a little longer, we have shifted as a society to relying on consumer response to affect change rather than government response to affect change. Now, I understand that consumer response and voters and individuals are the people who pressure government into affecting change. I feel like that is throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and I think that both have to happen simultaneously, but I think consumer response is a short-term fix, and government response and regulations is a long-term fix. And so since you're working on this as what I gather is a long-term project, philosophically, I would say that the two issues that I see unresolved as an audience member are whether or not there is really choice, as you describe, and whether or not consumer response can inspire a long-term fix. Those are the things that I would want to see as the project advances as vulnerable to objection. And I guess that's what I was trying to figure out with the questions.
Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I know you have a class in about 2.5 minutes, but this has been great, a wonderful discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you.